Good morning, late morning. I'm Jim Ferris, and I direct the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy, as well as serve as a professor at USC's School of Policy, Planning, and Development. On behalf of the Center's Board of Advisors, I'm delighted that you're able to join us for the Center's inaugural conversation on philanthropy. I'm thrilled to welcome our speakers for this afternoon, Tom Turney and Joel Fleischman. Let's give them a round of applause. Tom and Joel, we're so delighted that you've come out west to sort of share your thoughts with us. And I can tell you that we had a dinner last night with the Center's book club that was amazing. And if today is anything like last night, you're in for a real treat. So be thinking of your questions, because we're going to really make this conversational rather than any kind of formal speaking. Some thank yous before we get started with lunch. First, I want to thank Cara Esposito for hosting us here at the California Club. Thank you. And also serving on the host committee for this event. I also want to thank our board members who have been on the host committee for today. Fred Ali, whose leadership as chair of the board is indispensable to our success. Doug Mancino, Marvin Schottland, and Wendy Wachtel. Thank you all. I also want to recognize other members of the Board of Advisors who are with us today. Their sort of intellectual support and guidance has been pivotal in our success to date, and I want to recognize them. Kathy Hessian, Jack Knott, who as Dean of the School is instrumental in providing steadfast support for our intellectual work, Margot O'Connell, Esther Wachtel, our founding board chair, our catalyst for getting us going 12 years ago, and Jean Wilson. Thank you all. As some of you may know, the Center's mission is to provide research and analysis that helps philanthropists and foundations address our community's most pressing problems with greater impact. In doing this work, we are committed to making sure it's useful and usable. And to accomplish this, we are highly engaged with the field. Over the course of the last couple of years, we have observed the desire to overcome the fragmentation within philanthropy. As Brad Smith of the Foundation Center so vividly suggests, there is a pivotal need to build bridges in what he sees as the archipelago of philanthropy, lots of individual islands. And if we're going to have greater impact, we have to figure out how to connect those islands. We also have heard from many of you who have come to our speaker series that you would like an opportunity for a more intimate, conversational venue to explore topics of great interest to you. As a result of that, we are initiating this new series on conversations on philanthropy. The idea is to bring together philanthropic leaders from across the sector together with experts on a topic to share information and build networks so as to leverage the power of philanthropy here in the community. We will, of course, continue our Distinguished Speaker Series this spring, but we hope that these smaller, more intimate settings will give you as philanthropic leaders an opportunity to focus on strategies and to think about how you can have a greater impact in the important work you do. We hope that you will let us know what you think after today, and we welcome your suggestions. And I think the last thing I want to say before we have some lunch is to thank those of you in the room who are our philanthropic partners. Your sort of support, your ability to sort of underwrite the activities of the center is really paramount because you understand the importance of doing research and building the knowledge base of the field. So if you're one of our philanthropic partners, I'm going to ask you all to stand up so we can recognize y'all. Thank you. Okay. So nobody wants to stand this morning. I guess everybody's hungry. With that, enjoy your lunch, and after the main course, we will begin the program. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and the conversations. It's now my pleasure to begin the program and introduce our speakers for today, Tom Turney and Joel Fleischman. Tom is the co-founder and chairman of the Bridgespan Group, a nonprofit consulting firm serving the nonprofit sector and its funders, and one of the main sources of knowledge in the field of philanthropy and nonprofits today. Prior to his work at Bridgespan, he was a managing partner worldwide of Bain & Company. Some of you might remember Joel from our Distinguished Speaker Series back in the spring of 2007 when he was doing his last book tour on the Foundation, America's Best Kept Secret, I think is the subtitle. Joel is the faculty chair of the Duke University Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society and a professor of law and public policy sciences in the Duke University School of Law. He also served as president of Atlantic Philanthropic Service Company, the U.S. affiliate of Atlantic Philanthropies. Joel is a fellow Tar Heel, although over the years the shade of blue has gotten darker, especially during basketball season. But we, I always like to kid him about that. Anyway, again, with the spirit of this new series, this is supposed to be conversational. And so I'm going to start out with one question, maybe two, but I hope you have brought your own questions for these great intellectual thought leaders in the field. And what we're going to do is we have one mic now that we'll get around to you. So get Tracy's attention or Lizzie's attention, okay? And if you would keep your questions succinct and also introduce yourself, it would be very helpful in facilitating the conversation. Tom, Joel, I don't know who wants to start out, but what was the motivation behind the book? What do you hope to achieve? And what has been the biggest surprise since you've been doing all these conversations and talks around the country?
That's one question?
Well, you know, I'm a professor, so everything's complex.
Well, the answer, the motivation for the book is this guy here who came to me about 3 years ago and said, look, you've written a book on foundations and their impact. We at Bridgespan have had 8 years of engagement with nonprofits and philanthropy and foundations. Why don't we put our respective learnings together? And he said, besides, since you've already written the book, you don't have to do any of the writing. You just have to help us think about the matter. It's a great invitation. And so I said, okay, that's just fine. So that's exactly why the book came about. In a more serious vein, it came about because Bridgespan Group, as remarkable as it is, and it is remarkable, can deal with a very limited number of nonprofits in the United States. The question is, how do we do something, how Tom said, what can we do to take what we've learned to the much broader community of nonprofits around the country? And so the idea that he had was essentially, let's get into this so that we can generate information via the book, via the associated website that is related to the book, that can reach America's nonprofit community and foundations, broadly speaking. So that's the motivation of the book, right? That's the That's the first part of the question.
Let me say a couple things relative to that. First of all, vis-a-vis Joel, he downplays his value added in these things. The fact is, and some of you know this story, I won't go into all the details, but we bought Bain & Company in 1991 for $1. It was a management buyout. I moved from California, where I was born and raised, back to Boston, which is not a natural act. The wagon trains went in the other direction. Anyhow, And by the mid-'90s, the company was going, doing pretty well. I had an idea about creating what became Bridgespan, and had it not been for this guy, Bridgespan wouldn't exist. So we were introduced. He's running part of Atlantic Philanthropies, this anonymous foundation, and he invited me to New York without permitting me to know where I was going. And we had this, what I considered to be a clandestine meeting, which ultimately resulted in Atlantic Philanthropies putting up half the capital to launch Bridgespan. And he then spent 3 years with me, coaching me, helping me raise the rest of the millions of dollars we needed to raise, helping me put a board together, helping me find a law firm, helping me get a rather thorny approval of the IRS. Bridgespan wouldn't exist were it not for Joel. So I say that because this relationship is not just about this book. He changed my life. And Bridgespan wouldn't exist. It's hundreds of clients that we've been able to hopefully help would not have been served. The content, none of it would exist were it not for Joel and his courageous support of this new idea.
But in all fairness, Tom, it wasn't Joel, it was Atlantic Philanthropies, and it was this donor, and they put it all together. And they the ones, whatever I did, I had to do with their approval and their support. And they were very excited about the idea of creating an organization like Bridgespan.
Fair enough. So now, why the book, and what do we hope to achieve? We are in this country at an astonishing point in our history. When we examine how the next couple of decades might unfold, a few things are pretty clear. It is pretty clear there will be thousands and thousands of new donors, experienced donors giving away more money, and more wealth moving into society. That is a fact. There's just no way around, not just the wealth transfer, but people also giving while living and getting engaged earlier. When you have a Mark Zuckerberg writing a check for $100 million in his 20s. And it's not just the people with that amount of money, it's people younger. You can't find a college today that will admit a person who has zero community service. Young people start doing community service when they're, I don't know, it must be 5 now, and it becomes wired in. So we're at a time when participation in the social sector is escalating, participation as philanthropists, and you can see that happening. There's lots of indicators. Along with the money comes something more important than money, and that's time. People talk about the wealth transfer. It's the talent transfer that's making the bigger difference. When you see Teach for America receiving applications from 12% of Ivy League graduates, Bridgespan receiving 150 or 200 applicants for every entry-level analyst position. You see this not just at young people, but mid-career people, more encore careers. There's a talent transfer that is occurring, and there's a pattern in the book, by the way, that philanthropy that gets results tends to invest time and influence alongside money. Money alone usually doesn't buy results. And so we've got a wealth transfer over the next couple of decades, a talent transfer, and the third macro variable is learning. And it's centers like this and it's groups like this that are learning. We're learning faster. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was no Stanford Social Innovation Review. Many of these centers didn't exist. Organizations like ours or Foundation Strategy Group didn't exist. The McKinseys of the world did not have social sector practice areas, you name it. The content and the speed at which that content is shared did not exist. So more money, more talent, more learning, all accelerated. The reason for the book is we can do better. Both Joel and I are deeply committed and deeply believe that philanthropy in America underperforms, and we're deeply committed to doing whatever little bit we can to help it perform better. And because it's $300 billion a year, and will be a lot more than that in our lifetimes, imagine that philanthropy being 1% more effective, or 10% more effective, or 50% more effective. The amount of lives and how that impacts our community is extraordinary. So because in our own experience, and the data suggests, philanthropy underperforms what it could otherwise achieve, said maybe we could write a book that would be kind of a self-help book. By the way, the book was underwritten, the research and even us being here today, all of it was underwritten by Goldman Sachs Foundation. The website's underwritten by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Both organizations having a commitment to educate others to achieve better philanthropy. So that's our dream, our mission from God, if you will, is to do our little bit with Bridgespan's help and others' help to improve the results achieved with the scarce resources philanthropy can bring to the table.
I agree with everything he said. And the third part of Jim's question was, what has surprised us on this? Well, let me just lead off by saying what surprises me is the change in your philanthropic community and the extent to which there really is more of a philanthropic community that's in touch with one another than the first time I've met with Gene Wilson. And there was connection between a few of the large foundations. But look at the breadth of that now. And look, Tom and I have now been here for 2 days, meeting with a variety of people, most of whom you all know and most of whom know you. That's a change. And a lot of it has to do with the center that catalyzed that change and has brought people together. But the power of this philanthropic community here is a surprise to me, and it's a model for other cities as well. So more power to you, because there's no limit to what you can do if you do it together.
The other surprise is the magnitude of the unmet need. And I'm not talking about the unmet need in our communities, which we can somewhat calibrate. The magnitude of the unmet need of people who are trying to put their money to good use to figure out how to do it a little bit better. And that's been astonishing. The response to the book has been astonishing. And at first we kind of, well, what's really going on? You know, people are asking the most important, how can we improve? How can we get better? How can we get 10% better? How can we get 50% better? The absence of market forces means you have to want to improve your performance. Nobody's going to make you. No donor is fired from being a donor because their money doesn't achieve very good results. So we say excellence is self-imposed. So the unmet need that we have encountered, and by the way, it's an unmet need from individual donors, from families, from you know, the Zuckerbergs, the 20-somethings and 30-somethings that are going to be billionaires someday. It's an unmet need that cuts across foundation staff, decision makers of all kinds involved in philanthropy. It's extraordinary. And by the way, we're getting inquiries from Brazil, China, India, Europe. Okay, how do we do some of that stuff? We don't want to waste the money. We want to actually do something important for our communities, but we do not want to waste our scarce resources. So I guess that's the other thing I'd say is, you know, I'm not sure it's just the timing with the economy and people feeling they have to do more with less. That is for certain part of what's going on, but I doubt it's just the economy. I think there's something structural going on with people asking tough questions about how they can improve their performance.
You're just about to get amplification. It's not on.
I am technologically impaired.
We all are.
I have a very good voice. What I would like to hear is you talk a little bit about how you measure effectiveness. How do you measure these? How do you take some of these ideas and quantify them so that you can, in fact, really relate to them and make a difference?
The question is, how do you measure results and quantify how you're achieving? That's a complicated question, but let us answer it the following way. We quite purposely used a philanthropic initiative as the unit in the book. What I mean by that is that we did not say, here are 100 great philanthropists. We didn't do that. We said, here are examples of excellent philanthropy. A specific initiative that had a strategy, a goal. Sometimes it evolved over time. John and Nell Dorr You know, we talked about that earlier today. It's one of our favorite stories. In the 50s, decided, you know, to fund painting white lines on the sides of the road. And $100,000 a year for many, many years, and lots of advocacy with highway departments. And now we have white lines all around this country. And that has saved tens of thousands of lives. So the result is kind of clear on something like that. Don and Doris Fisher, with what they did with KIPP, when they had this struggling little idea with a couple of crazy entrepreneurs. And look at KIPP today. It's, some would say, the gold standard for charter management organizations. It's at least very, very good. So our unit of analysis, if you want to call it that, were initiatives. It turns out that the measurement, the way you judge progress is specific to individual initiatives. If it's an advocacy kind of initiative, it's much more complicated to measure results than if it is, you know, providing scholarships to individuals to go to school. So therefore, it's impossible for us to generalize, but I would say the following. I would say it is, in general, more important to judge progress than to measure results. What I mean when I say that is that as business people have entered the social sector and there's been a greater desire to get results, and this is mostly over the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen the emphasis on measurement increase, which is good. But there are different reasons to measure. One reason to measure is to prove, for example, a certain social intervention really works well. And that's useful. Randomized controlled tests, and you can kind of prove stuff. But another reason to measure is just say, how are we doing? And how can we do a little bit better? So there's measuring to learn. In our experience, I usually speak for myself, most donors can identify if they take the time to be thoughtful about it, the grants that have really worked well and the grants that are really the dogs. You can usually figure out the stars from the dogs. If you can't figure out the stars from the dogs, that's an entirely new problem. No measurement system is going to help you. And if you can figure out the stars from the dogs, you can learn from that. Say, what's going on with these stars? How did we get good results over here, and how come these are flawed? And that leads to more inquiry, which improves performance. So there's measuring to learn, and there's measuring to kind of keep score for whatever reason, and there's measuring to prove certain interventions. So those 2 points. One, measurement is specific to the intervention, specific to the initiative, and two, it's done for different reasons.
I would add to that also the most important thing to happen between a donor and a grant recipient is to be very clear at the beginning about what success is. And you can't measure anything if you haven't had that conversation and if you haven't had what we lawyers would call a meeting of the minds about that. Because that's the foundation step that will lay out whatever else you do on it. And when you get that kind of an agreement, that consensual agreement on what it is the two of you all, the donor and the donee, are trying to do, that's the base on which you do it. And then you take it from there. It may be metrical performance benchmarks, or it may not be. It may not be quantitative. But the important thing is to get that agreement and to lay out what progress means and where you want to go with it, so that you can figure out whether you're getting better or not.
Hi. I couldn't agree more with that. It needs to be in writing and very specifically specified. Otherwise, your money is probably not going where you want. But my question is, and you mentioned Teach for America. I did give Teach for America a multi-million-dollar gift recently, and I took half back. And I'll tell you why, and it also is part of my question. 3-4 decades ago, philanthropy in this country, it kind of filled in the cracks around the edges. Now that we have such deep fissures, I don't really believe that our philanthropy is addressing society where it's at today. I think we're practicing very traditional philanthropy as was reflected by society 30, 40 years ago. Everything is broken systemically. And Teach for America, been in existence 20 years, stellar organization. I do love the organization. However, they have not reformed and transformed K through 12 public school education because they haven't gotten a critical mass in place. And in your book, Elaine Wynn, her organization has affected 1.3 million children annually. But that provides those children with what they need. But it doesn't change us systemically. And I believe that philanthropy at this point needs to be addressed to the most need and the most systemic change possible. And it means you've got to go very deep, and it's very time consuming. And I believe it means that the philanthropists have to get much more involved in their philanthropy and go out and see and touch and feel the people they're serving and their money and all that. So how would you see that? And somewhat aligned with that is, what do you think of the 5% minimum in view of the fact that that money is 100% tax deducted? So to me, it's now public money, not your money anymore. But you can keep building it in your foundation year after year after year. And there's somewhere around $500 billion sitting in foundations across this country. And we've never had greater need. But nobody wants to spend down. And I feel like there isn't going to be a civilization to spend down on anymore if we don't do something. We're in dire circumstances. But I really don't believe that this is getting across. So I know I've given you a lot there to respond to, but...
Yes, a lot. Well, the first point that I make is that there are plenty of people who are spending down. If you look at the birth of foundations over the course of the last 20 years, most of the large foundations are in fact spending down that have been created since 1990, which means that they're spending down quite specifically because the donors have decided that they want to have the kind of impact, the maximum impact they can get. They don't want to spend 5% of the capital. They want to spend all the capital during their lifetimes and guide it to the kinds of things that they care about. The second point that and that's the case, that's true. It's a true statistic, and so it's important to know that that's a movement that's going on. There are plenty of foundations that are still perpetual foundations. Well, we're giving you the perspective that we have, which is the sector as a whole. The second point that I would make is that foundations, philanthropy, cannot do everything in society. What we are seeing in our society is a massive failure of public leadership. It's true at the California level. It's true at the national level. And remember that what the total spending of foundations in this country is minuscule compared to what the federal government spends, not to mention what the federal government and the state government spend. So to put all of the burden for remedying these fissures on foundations strikes me as a very serious mistake to make. It isn't to say that they shouldn't. Listen, when in the 40 years or so, almost 50 years that I've been involved in nonprofits, I have seen foundations and philanthropies move much more towards the help trying to solve the problems that you're talking about than they did ever before. So there's been, in my view, a lot of progress that's been made in terms of the kinds of things foundations do and donors do. And I think it's wrong not to recognize that change that has taken place. But the important thing to understand really is that we've got to do whatever we do to deal with these major social problems, disparities that exist. We've got to do it together. Foundations cannot do it alone. The total amount of charitable giving in the United States is about $300 billion annually. It may be low, but it's the highest in the world. It is the highest amount of philanthropic giving in any country in the world.
So therefore they can't, but we
Yeah,
can.
well, but it's still 2.3% of GDP, and the next nearest country is 0.8% of GDP. So, my point is that's the strength of America. It's not something, to belittle, it seems to me.
It's not something to belittle. But knowing where we are and how much more needs to be done and can be done, and if we don't think government's doing a good job, then let's take it upon ourselves to do it and spend some of the money. And if we think we can spend it better, which I think we do, then we should be doing it. And I don't happen to personally think that $300 million a year in philanthropy,
300 billion.
billion, I'm sorry, is that much compared to where we're at.
Well,
You know, too bad. I mean, honestly, you can't do anything about this. These are individual choices. It is astonishing to me. It is astonishing to me, actually, to see American generosity. You know, as I go around, I think the level of generosity and humanity and caring and commitment is extraordinary. There's not a nation in the world where people volunteer like America. There's not a nation in the world where you see 30-year-olds writing checks. It just doesn't happen. And
because of the public leadership and because the failure to deal with these issues.
well, and all kinds of structural issues that have nothing to do with philanthropy. Two points on your questions, because I think they're relevant. One is the trend toward giving while living is a profound trend. I can't tell you how many wealthy people I've talked to who say, I will never set up a foundation. I don't want one of those. They write checks through donor-advised funds. People are giving away tens of millions of dollars a year. You don't even know they're doing it. And some of them you might know they're doing it, but they're not going to buy buildings and put people in them and staff them up. Some will, but most won't. So the baby boom generation and some of the folks, you know, the Pierre Omidyars and the Jeff Skolls and so forth, the world are going to, you know, they'll get traction. They are planning to give a lot of wealth away in the next 25 years, which is why I'm making the point I'm making. Because I think that 300 billion could ratchet up dramatically from individuals, not from institutions, from first generation donors, not from fifth generation donors. So that's point one. Point two on the systemic change allows me to make a point about traps. There are lots of traps in philanthropy. There are facts of life, like the problems are really, really hard. That can't necessarily be avoided, but the traps can be avoided. And one of the traps is not right-sizing your appetite to your resources. So for example, on this issue of systemic change, if you have a certain amount of money and you really want to measure results and you care about education, and you say, gosh, what can I do? Well, you can give scholarships, and every single person you give a scholarship to, you can know what happened with great certainty. But that you're only giving 10 scholarships a year. And I know people that do that, and it's great, and they bring the kids back, and they have reunions and so forth, so you can do that. Now let's say, gosh, I wanted to do more than that. Well, I'm going to move up a notch, and I'm really going to try to help transform this inner city school. Or I'm going to help grow a charter management organization. That's a higher degree of difficulty. It takes more resources and a longer commitment. And there will be less causality. You won't actually be able to prove, you know, what you did versus what happened. So that's a notch up on the scale of systemic. Then you go another notch. You know, I want to really help change an entire school system. I grew up in Portland. I want to change the Portland school district. Okay, it's a small, medium size. How do I do that? Now, that takes more money, or at least more influence. It takes many more years. The causality of did it change because of you or in spite of you? You can't really figure that out. They say, you know, Portland's not big enough. I actually want to tackle LA school district. I want systemic change in LA. Didn't somebody try that once? I mean, systemic change in LA. Okay, now, how much money, how much time, how much influence, how much collaboration is necessary to try to make that happen? And will you ever know for certain what it is you did versus what are the, no. And then you say, yeah, I want to change all the US schools. So the point is, the trap is people who aspire towards systemic change and are behaving like they're giving scholarships. And you just have to make sure you're right-sized. And one of the opportunities, by the way, that we have encountered a lot is the more you move up that ladder of importance and degree of difficulty, the more collaboration is important. And the absence of collaboration, donor-to-donor collaboration, is extraordinary. Sure.
I am doing the latter, Systemic Change LAUSD. It's called Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. And I am putting $50 million plus into that. So that's where the basis of my questions come from, because I believe that that is the, I think that's what we need to be doing.
And that's, and you know,
and we are being successful, by the way, despite what the LA Times might report. And I also, my time is there. I have an office with them. I work with them every week. I'm in the schools. I go to Watts and South Central and all that.
All that's fine. My point was simply, just not to lose it, we want to right size the resources and investment to the problem you're trying to tackle.
I'm Gene Wilson, an advisory board member at the center, and thank you. We should all be encouraged by your forecast of ever-increasing wealth coming into philanthropy. But another point you made in your book is the importance of the agents of wealth, those influentials who are not necessarily wealthy, but who don't think philanthropy and don't think, haven't been philanthropic, and now have huge potential to influence this new wealth in terms of philanthropy. And I wonder if you're aware of any effort on how to inform those people about their influence, their potential influence with this emerging philanthropy, and if there's no effort, do you think one is possible?
You all heard the question. This is, if you, the question was, is there a way to influence or assist, I'll use the phrase, advisors to these next generation wealthy, and the advisors could be lawyers, they could be financial advisors and other folks. Are there efforts that are going on right now to do that? And if so, what might they be, or any ideas? From what, you don't know what you don't know, but from what I know, this is an enormous opportunity. It, I suspect, is one of the reasons why the Goldman Sachs Foundation invested the funds they did for us to produce the research in the book in the first place. That, in fact, philanthropy is deeply personal. We know that. And if you're going to make decisions, as a couple say, to give your money away, you turn to trusted advisors. And you don't meet them on the street. They're advisory relationships that develop over years. And it's with your financial advisor, your lawyer, folks like that. This last Monday, we were in Washington in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I went back to Boston. Sorry, this last Monday we were in Washington in the morning with PBS, and then I went back to Boston and met with the partners and many of the clients of a law firm called Hemingway & Barnes. It's one of the oldest law firms in the city of Boston, which means many generations in that area. And they do a lot of estate planning. And it was exactly on this issue. The partners of the law firm were saying, we don't know that much about how to put philanthropy to work to get results. And many of them are managing trusts that don't have any principles left. I mean, they're managing the money and giving it out. And then the clients were saying some of the same things. So I suspect there is enormous opportunity. How one accesses that, I don't know. I mean, the book is written in a way that advisors could use, but we now got requests. I received some last Monday with that event. They wanted the teaching notes for the book. Said, okay, I've got the book, but now could you give me the teaching notes so that when I meet with my client, I can give them the book and then kind of know just a little bit more than they know. So I'm hoping, we're building this a lot of big website content. I'm hoping we can educate, but boy, we are wide open to ideas. If there is a way to make the wealth advisors, lawyers, to the next generation of philanthropists more effective in coaching their clients, enormous upside.
Brett Elliott with the Weinberg Foundation. So in recent years, there's been a lot more focus, all for good reasons, on strategy, developing strategy to guide you for I know that you talk in your book about the other piece of this, which is the execution piece, and maybe not enough attention being given to execution. So could you talk more about that?
Okay, I will. We all do, philanthropists do everything they do, virtually everything they do, through nonprofit organizations. The grants are made to nonprofit organizations, and they're always, by definition, grantees, even if you've done arrangements with for-profit organizations, which you can do to get particular jobs done. So the question really is, how do you relate to the grantees? Execution of strategies is absolutely critical to the success of the strategies. If you don't execute well, you might as well not have the strategy in the first place. So, you know, for us, thinking about the question of execution means, what's my relationship? What am I accountable for? How am I going to deal with the grantees? What do I think about such things as overhead, for example? How much overhead? What kind of overhead? All of those are really critical questions because typically grantees are underfinanced. They are certainly undersupported in their general operating support, by and large. And those, if you interview nonprofits, and many of you, I'm sure, have done that, the first thing I always hear is, we just don't have enough operating support. We just don't. These efforts are really coming out of our hide because we can't find anybody to pay the rent. We can't find anybody to pay the electricity, or we can't find anybody to provide the information technology kinds of things that we need. So we focused a lot on thinking about how do you relate to grantees. And the last question in the book is, am I getting better, which means am I doing better in getting the money to the beneficiaries that we really want to help with this money? So it's absolutely critical, those three components. What am I responsible for, as opposed to what is the grantee responsible for, and what do I need to do in order to enable the grantee to do a better job of what they're doing on a continuing basis?
Another important point. Bain & Company is a strategy consulting firm. It's been around a long time. We spun off Bain Capital and became principals, actually building, investing companies. And so a lot of data on this. Hands down, both at Bain & Company, at Bain Capital, and at Bridgespan from our experiences, execution is dramatically more important than strategy. It is not even close. And all the emphasis that's placed intellectually on PowerPoint slides and theories of change and all of that, you have to get that. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient. And so we tend to invest appropriately, more or less, in strategic kinds of things, but we dramatically underinvest in execution. And in fact, many philanthropists are better at strategy than execution. And there are lots of patterns where you see the execution fall short. The question, what does it take to get the job done, is an illustration. Most folks underinvest in the capacity downstream necessary to deliver. And that's where you see organizations starved for the resources they need. Not the programmatic resources, but the CFO, the chief operating officer, the stuff they need to deliver. So we tend to fall short on execution. And by the way, that's no different than the businesses. It's much easier to have a playbook than run the plays. It just is. And you can have the prettiest playbook ever created and never score a point. So just as you're thinking about results, say, gosh, is it a failure of strategy or is it a failure of execution? Don't forget execution.
I think you just described UCLA's football program. Dr. Wallace here. For folks that have more of a personal philanthropy and are focused, there are many and aren't really going to put a ton of money in one specific project that they're personally staying closely involved in. There are many very well thought of charities that sound really great, but on the trusted advisor piece, are there really any good monitoring bodies that really can assess whether folks are doing what they say they're doing in their press and in their handouts and in the discussions you have with them? I think the greatest anxiety many of us have in personal giving is that the money will be wasted on somebody in a scandalous way, like you read about here and there, where folks have basically siphoned the money off for personal gain rather than for the mission. So who can you really trust relative to the diligence on these many specific foundations or charitable organizations?
There are many respected wealth advisors in the country, consultants, individual practitioners and others, some of them not very good, many of them quite good. And typically, donors who are concerned about the questions that you just raised really do build a relationship with some of those the philanthropic advisors. I've been involved with a couple of projects which have had such, one of the oldest ones is the Philanthropic Initiative. It's called now TPI, started by Peter Karoff about some 20 years ago. And they take on their clients, basically want them to do exactly what you've just described. And they work with them when they make the grant. They continue to work with them in monitoring the grant and being sure the money is being spent. But TPI is just one of a number of possibilities. Any one of the but the important thing is to develop a relationship. Don't try to do it on a one-off basis and pick somebody out of the air. Whoever does that really needs to be somebody you know and somebody who knows you and who can really and can follow through on them. It is a really important function that you're talking about.
It's a personal relationship, and many of us have those, but I don't think any of our wealth advisors specifically do diligence on each of these potential donor organizations. And there are a bunch that are out there, High Marks and others that claim sort of like a Morningstar rating system. Are any of those things valuable, or any of those things?
I have a point of view about that, which is they are somewhat valuable, but not to the extent one could make a decision upon that data. And the reason is they often are relying on bad input data. They're relying on 990 forms and things like that from nonprofits that are just not rigorous and certainly not accurate, even with the new form. In addition, they are often rating people on what we might refer to as inputs, not outputs. So they will rate people according to their overhead costs rather than the results they actually achieve. It's really complex, back to where we were before, to measure the results of all these different organizations. You couldn't do it in a fair way and certainly not keep it updated. So they default to measuring inputs. Measuring inputs and suggesting that less overhead is automatically better, for example, would be to suggest that the airlines with the lowest maintenance costs ought to be the airlines that you fly the most. And the hospitals with the fully depreciated equipment and no doctors, just nurses, ought to be where you go for heart surgery. And by the way, the schools with the fewest books ought to be better because books cost money. Of course, that's silly. We make decisions in life based on results, not inputs, based on outputs. And so these rankings that rank based on overhead ratios, where the ratios themselves are inaccurate, the data's bad in general, and it has as a premise that less is more, is just a flawed. That's one example of a measure that's flawed. And by the way, while I'm on this particular hobby horse, the government and many donors will say anything over 15% overhead is bad. The average in American business is 25% overhead, calculated the same way. The average in service organizations, which is a little bit more like human service organizations some of us might support, is 32%. So where does this 12% or 15% come from? It's just some arbitrary thing that people now think they have to adhere to, and it starves the organizations. Therefore, if you can't rely on published lists, what do you rely on to make your decisions? A couple of observations. The people, initiatives that tend, or philanthropists now, people who tend to be successful in their philanthropy, in general, do fewer things in a more significant way over a longer period of time. So fewer, bigger, longer. Partly that because they're investing their time. It's like you talked about your systemic change. They're investing time and influence as well as money. And you just can only invest, there's only so many hours in a day. You can't be the champion of homeless one day and poor children the next and so forth. So you pick spots, fewer, bigger, longer. That doesn't mean you don't write grants around that, because you're asked to do things and you buy a table at this event and this and that. But you have a few things that you're kind of pretty focused on. And if you have a lot of time and a lot of money, you can have a bigger portfolio of those things. That allows you to kick the tires. it allows you to figure out where the A+ organizations are. Now, I, for example, care a lot about conservation. I've been involved in conservation for 30 years. The organization I started with is the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy. There are many of them, many that is conservation organizations, but I met those people, I started contributing, I started volunteering, ended up on the board. I've been involved there 30 years now, I'm on the national board. Are there other fine organizations in the environmental space? Yes. Are there local organizations? Yes. So you kick the tires. And if you're not spread too thin, you can afford to kick the tires. The last thing I'd say is there's nothing more important than a high-quality board which is engaged. And so if you see people on a board of directors of a nonprofit whom you respect, and you get the sense that they are not just hanging their hat in the room, but actually adding value, that's a really great indicator. And where you see trouble with nonprofits, it's often that someone involved got mad cow disease, and the board didn't rein them in. Anyhow.
Doug Mancino. Every year, the IRS processes about 75,000 exemption applications for newly formed organizations. I'd say 90% of those are mom and pop shops, but some of them survive and succeed to some level. I'm a believer that foundations should play a role in the consolidation of good organizations to make them better organizations that serve broader populations. I'd be curious, A, whether you share that view, and B, what kinds of practices have you seen in your survey that are really things that organizations should be adopting. I'm on the board of an organization over the weekend, and we came up, you talk about capacity building. We said capacity building with strings. Be interested in your experiences.
I think that we do agree with you, but with one qualification, which is that there are some, it is true that we have too many nonprofits in the U.S. It is true that many of them are fragile. But it is also the case that they represent lots of different substantive views and are important to communities sometimes. So, but as a general matter, we should be doing more as philanthropists to get people to work together and not to create lots of new organizations that fail, but to help organizations that are succeeding to some degree to get better and reach wider audiences for a wider client basis for themselves. So that's, I think it is something that we I don't want to speak for Tom, but we generally agree on, I think, on that as well. What was the second part of your question, Doug?
What techniques have you seen that you would judge as being successful or at least moderately successful? Incentives, for example, back-end awards after they successfully complete a merger or do something that is what you believe would be in the strategic best interest?
The data suggests, and Bridgespan's actually researched this a little bit, that the number of, if you will, nonprofit mergers are increasing. And they're quite more prevalent than most of us know. That's, I suppose, a type of good news. The bad news is that more often than not, in stark contrast to the business world, they are two weak organizations put together, two small weak organizations put together to form one medium-sized weak organization. And they are done, therefore, when organizations are failing and have no other choice. They are done for purposes of preservation, which is bizarre because the reality is there are very few barriers to entry, so there will be always more nonprofits, and in a civic society, I'm not sure that's terrible. But nonprofits, unlike businesses, can linger for years and not go out of business. And merging them sometimes perpetuates mediocrity as opposed to eliminates mediocrity. So the way it has worked, when it has worked well, is when donors collaborate to encourage more of a strategic merger that is taking two strong organizations and making one organization that's even stronger. So it's a way of growth.
Or
rather,
one strong in 1 week.
Or one strong in 1 week. But it's enhancing, the product you end up afterwards is on balance stronger, not weaker. The second thing I'd say, which is just a different way of thinking about it rather than the new ones and the old ones, and it is the better organizations add disproportionate value to society. At least this is Bridgespan's observation. So if you took all nonprofits, by the way, whether they're a startup with, 2 people and kind of been around for a year, or whether it's a big system with lots of people, the fact is there's a top third and a bottom third. Now, you don't always know which is which, but they're there. The top third is adding dramatically more value to society than the bottom third. They just are. And this, by the way, is true in business. It's true everywhere. So one question when you start thinking about the size of nonprofits is to ask, of those early entries, for example, where are the stars? Where are the high potential? And make sure that those aren't getting lost along the way. Because that's where there's more upside, by helping the organizations that have the capacity, the resources to contribute even more than they are.
Okay, it's 1:30 and I see people starting to fidget despite the vigorous conversation. So let me just conclude and thank Joel and Tom for coming westward. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I would ask you to save the date, March 20th. Our next speaker series event is with Peter and Jennifer Buffett, who will talk about their work with the Novo Foundation and inspiring to empower women and girls worldwide. So see you then.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank Jim and all of you all for supporting the center and for welcoming Tom and me here so warmly. So thank you all very much.